So, I would like to welcome you all today. This is the second talk of the online series Inferentialism on Naturalized Grounds, organized by the LMS Center, University of Hradec Králové. Today, the speaker is our colleague, Laco Koreň, and he will talk about confirmation bias. Laco, you can start.
Thank you, Matej, for giving me this opportunity. So it's a challenge that it's going to be recorded, so I have to do my best. Okay, so the volume was supposed to be about naturalized inferentialism, so I have some stage setting how to connect the topic to naturalized inferentialism. So I have some ideas about how the inferentialist naturalist approaching to reasoning should look like. So following Brandom, inferentialists trace the roots of human reasoning to practices and skills for giving and asking for reasons. That's famous. On conceptual grounds, they say a lot about the nature and structure of this trick, as Brandom calls it. But in my view, they have rarely explored the question of why and how humans developed the trick, that is, its practical value for social creatures and its genesis. So in my opinion, a more anthropological and specifically genealogical development of the idea can be illuminating, and I try to do something in this direction in my book, which was published last year, as a couple of other people, including Jarda Peregrino and Preston Stovall, tried in their books. So this, in my view, this anthropological and genealogical reconstruction of the inferentialist idea is akin in spirit to what Hugh Price calls subject naturalism in his books from the last decade, as probably all of you know. So that's the introduction to how this can be connected to inferentialism and in a naturalist spirit, and in what kind of naturalist spirit. And it seems to me that if we think about developing the inferentialist project in this anthropological direction, then we should listen to extant contemporary interaction approaches to reasoning, which look promising because in their own way they want to develop the same idea, but in their very distinct, in some respect, different ways. So the interactionist or the representative interaction theories, in my view, are the theories of Mercier and Sperber. This is the most famous one, and they are the inspirators of other approaches, including the approach of Andy Norman and the approach of two authors, Smith and Wald. In my paper, and this talk is based on the paper, but unfortunately I can't go into all the details. So my paper reviews all those three interactionist accounts. So they have some common premises and common approach, although the result differs in many respects. So their explanation, what they want to explain, to shed light on, is our skills for producing, assessing, and responding to reasons and their characteristic features. So the features which are interesting to them concern when and why these reasoning skills work well or badly, respectively. This is the most important datum and most important thing to explain, to shed light on. And the question...
Sorry, just a second. The slides I can see are rather small, so I just want to check whether everyone can see it and read it. And yeah, this is better. This is better.
Okay, so I just... Yeah, okay. So they explain them are the skills for producing, assessing, and responding to reasons and their characteristic features, including when they work well and badly. And the question of specific explanatory perspective is, what adaptive value or function could those skills have had for our ancestors such that it would explain their existence and their characteristic features? And the strategy common to all those approaches is that it just doesn't seem, as data show, that those skills are designed to perform some adaptive function in their individual use, because they do not seem to work very well or optimally in their individual use. But it does seem, again, the data show that they are designed to perform some adaptive function in interaction, that is in their social communicative use. And they differ in this kind of function which they postulate, but the strategy and the framework is quite the same. So this is the framework of all the interactionist theories, and the main data which are claimed to be predicted or explained concern when and why we should reason more or less skillfully or reliably. And the data are such that it seems that there is skillful or more skillful and reliable reasoning when people exchange reasons and arguments with other reasoners, especially in properly structured groups. But there is less skillful, reliable reasoning when people reason on their own. An explanation is of the sort, this all makes perfect sense if reasoning was designed by natural selection to be used interactively rather than individually. So this is the explanatory strategies, and I'm fine with that. In my view, it indeed makes good sense. This whole data makes good sense if the skills were honed to be actualized or exercised in interaction, extant in enhancing and sophisticating already beneficial social communicative practices and skills. So I'm not going to challenge this claim. I'm kind of sympathetic to that, and seems to me consistent with what the inferentialists suggest and so on. So that's not my concern. It seems to me that it's the strength of those theories that they have this kind of structure and they can offer this kind of explanation. But they go beyond this claim. And they make some especially bold claims, and also, as bold claims usually are, they are also controversial claims. So one bold claim they make, explanatory claim, is that they want to explain, or they claim to explain, why human reasoning should display something like confirmation bias, or as Mercier Sperber call it, my-side bias. So for instance, Mercier and Sperber and Smith and Wald specify this bias in the following way. That reasoning systematically works to find reasons for our ideas or beliefs or views, and against ideas we oppose, it always takes our side. So that's supposed to be the idea of that our reasoning is systematically, robustly influenced by some kind of confirmation bias in this sense. And Andy Norman has something similar in mind, and he says that confirmation bias is the tendency to look for instances that confirm our preconceptions, and the correlative tendency to overlook evidence that conflicts with favored views. So this is something they want to explain, which is okay because it's interesting phenomenon, and they also claim to explain it quite plausibly within their framework. Each of these three authors or interactionists have their own views about that, more or less subtle, and so on. So that's the claim. And their explanation also have some structure, kind of similar, which is of the following sort. In individual reasoning, confirmation bias is indeed a serious troublemaker, a bug vis-a-vis its typically postulated function of improving individual cognition via reflection on reasons. But in interactive reasoning, confirmation bias seems to be a useful design feature. So the feature of the kind that helps interactive reasoning to reliably and efficiently perform this or that postulated function. There's also a difference in the postulation function, but all claim that confirmation bias is a kind of design feature that facilitates their favored postulated function of interactive reasoning. So after all, if the skills of reasoning were designed for interactive use, we should expect them to work well in such uses, but not necessarily in individual uses. So also design features of interactive reasoning should facilitate such uses, but not necessarily individual uses. So it may be that confirmation bias is a bug or a sort of troublemaker in individual reasoning, but at the same time it can be a kind of useful design feature in interactive reasoning. So that's the explanatory strategy, and that's the claim. And my objective in the paper and in this talk is not, I don't know, not very ambitious, but the objective is that it reflects my state of mind. I'm just not convinced that this particular claim has been made good. So I tend to sympathize with a lot of claims they make. I'm critical of other claims they make, and I'm specifically critical, and I focus on this claim in my paper. I focused on other claims of Mercier-Sperber in my book, also critically, but this one was put to side, and I sort of, already then, I sort of suspected that I'm not in agreement, but then I developed this disagreement in this paper. So when I argue, or try to argue case by case, that confirmation bias tends to be counterproductive or troublemaker also in interactive reasoning, not just in individual reasoning. Or in other way, insofar as it tends to be a troublemaker in individual reasoning, it also tends to be a troublemaker in interactive reasoning, though it may cause less harm in interactive reasoning than in individual reasoning. Somehow interactive reasoning has features which may compensate for confirmation bias, but still I claim or argue that less harmful is still not useful, and design feature has to be useful. It has to facilitate or promote or to make better function the kind of ability of which it is supposed to be the design feature. And if I'm right on this, which is up to you to evaluate, then confirmation bias is unlikely to have evolved as its design feature, as a design feature of interactive reasoning. So in the paper I focus on all three accounts, but here I do not have time to do that. So I just have to focus on the most representative proposal of Mercier and Sperber. By the way, I think that the proposal of Smith and Wolf doesn't have anything specific to add to Mercier and Sperber in this respect, so I can put it to side. The proposal of Andy Norman is more interesting in this respect. I can eventually say something about that in the debate, but I do not have right now time to go through it. So it's more cooperative proposal and so on, but let me focus just on Mercier and Sperber. That's enough stuff for today. So I have to say something briefly about this conception of, although I suspect that almost all of you know something about it. So I will be very brief, so maybe that would be oversimplifying. But Mercier and Sperber proposed this. They proposed that reasoning originally evolved to perform this kind of social communicative function, namely to produce considerations, reasons, or arguments intended to persuade others to adopt one's view and to evaluate such considerations so as to be persuaded only by good ones. The good ones, according to them, must be such which are somehow indicative of true views or more correct views. Such skills were adaptive according to Mercier and Sperber hypothesis because they helped people to transmit or share more beliefs, including more true or valuable beliefs. For people were not always able to trust the content of the message or the author of the message, and so they needed some kind of assurance that they won't be misled. So communicators started to communicate a favorable or persuasive case for their message, so kind of reasons or arguments or proto-arguments, if you want. And receivers of those considerations started to assess them so as to be persuaded only by good ones. So this is kind of dialectics that somebody wants to sell his message and somebody has an interest to buy it, but also is interested to buy only good messages. So he is interested to hear some kind of reasons or considerations in favor of this message, particularly if he disagrees with the message. And so he who wants to communicate it or sell the message has to give some reasons which would be convincing. So that's the basic context for the evolution of reason giving according to this hypothesis. So now, that was very brief, I'm sorry for that, but now what about the confirmation bias? So the idea is quite straightforward. If one is to convince others that one's view is the right one, the one worth holding or worth adapting, that one would naturally seek out and produce considerations speaking in favor of one view or against conflicting views or arguments. So prima facie, it seems counterproductive for one to look for reasons speaking against one's view. So if you want to sell your view, the idea is you probably won't search for or produce consideration against it. That's something that they explicitly say repeatedly. So for Mercier and Sperber, this tendency basically amounts to confirmation bias or my-side bias, as they call it, because they recall as they define this bias, reasoning systematically works to find reasons for our ideas and against ideas we oppose. It always takes our side. So why? Because we want to persuade others. That's the explanation, quite straightforward. So important thing is that they distinguish two uses of reasoning. So the productive one and the evaluative one. So giving reasons and assessing reasons. And they claim, which is kind of cautious claim, but it seems to me that it's still problematic. That would be my last argument. They claim that confirmation bias strongly directs, this is their word, strongly directing, only the process of producing or giving reasons for one's views, not the process of evaluating reasons for opposed views or different views. After all, it is often in our ancestors' interest to get from others beliefs likely to be correct. We can learn from them. In part, that is why we are supposed to be interested in supporting evidence or reasons if we can't immediately accept them. So for instance, if we disagree with them or we just do not see why or how they could be right. So that's why we want to hear some reasons so that we could accept them, because we can't accept them on trust. So, but then, according to Mercier and Sperber, we shouldn't be biased to evaluate or assess others' claims and arguments as wrong by default, just because they clash with our beliefs or arguments. Because if we assume by default that they are wrong, so we would assume that there is nothing to learn from them, and so we wouldn't change our views. So if argumentation is in part about changing the views of others, so that would be obviously counterproductive. They are aware of that, so they postulate that assessment of reasons, that there have to be an aspect of reasoning, in particular in assessing reason, that have to be that mustn't be prone to confirmation bias, or at least to strong confirmation bias. So that's what they say about this distinction. And then they add an important thing. They say that this is also closely connected to what they call a division of cognitive or argumentative labor. So they say confirmation bias not only is a natural tendency if you want to persuade others. It is also said to facilitate an efficient division of cognitive labor that is conducive to better outcomes of interactive reasoning, especially in groups or in properly structured groups, because not each group works very well, but some groups can work well, including cognitively. So they say being prone to strong confirmation bias in this productive use, each arguer focuses only on the pros of his or her view or position and on the cons of dissenting views or positions. Eventually, however, if everybody does that, that's the division of labor, the pros and cons of every view will be represented and explored in some depth and detail without any arguer needing to explore them all. So that seems fine because you save efforts and labor. Others would do that. And the chances are, if the Borg is so divided, that the better idea will eventually emerge and prevail. That's called the principle of truth wins in some groups, especially in some collaborative groups, which have the right kind of structure. Okay, so that's the idea that not only the confirmation bias is a kind of natural tendency if you want to propagate your idea, your view, if you want to sell it and convince others to buy it, but it also somehow starts and facilitates a kind of useful and efficient cognitive division of labor, which eventually leads to good outcomes, and specifically to better outcomes than individual reasoning, in which this division of labor obviously can't takes place. So here is what Mercier and Sperber conclude regarding the confirmation bias and interactive reasoning. So if reason giving evolved for the function of producing arguments in order to propagate our ideas or sell our ideas, we should expect it to exhibit a strong my-side bias or confirmation bias. People overwhelmingly produce arguments that support their point of view and attack that of the interlocutor, as Mercier says in his later article. Or when defending a point of view, the my-side bias is a good thing. It is a feature, not a bug. If the function of reasoning, when it produces reason, is to justify one's actions or to convince others, then it should have a my-side bias, which is kind of strong claim. It's a kind of evolutionary claim that if some ability evolved for some kind of purpose in some kind of context, then it should have this kind of feature because it would be useful. It would make for a good design, for a better design that we would have if the feature was absent. So that's what I'm interested in, but strikes me as an interesting claim, but also I think that it's problematic claim, but at least I'm so far not convinced that I should accept it, this idea. So is this conclusion warranted? That's my question. So the idea is that confirmation bias is a useful design feature if on the assumption that reasoning evolved for an interactive use and in particular for persuasion. That's how I understand the thesis. So let's look on persuasion and argumentation. There are different kinds of persuasion and argumentation, it seems to me, and I'm no theorist of argumentation and persuasion, but just a simple distinction. So persuasion presupposes at least two parties, at least one of which is to persuade the other that what he or she thinks or says about some issue at hand is right. An argumentation as a tool of persuasion may be used to persuade others to accept the claim that the arguer agrees with or holds oneself. Pardon, that should be reversed. That shouldn't be manipulative, deceiving argumentation. That should be non-manipulative argumentation. Or the second case, argumentation may be used to persuade others to accept the claim that an arguer makes but doesn't believe oneself. This would be the manipulative case. Sorry for the mistake. So two cases to consider. And we can ask in each case if it's really plausible to claim that something like confirmation bias as defined or as characterized by Mercier and Sperber is a useful design feature facilitating this kind of argumentation, one or the other. So to me, it seems that confirmation bias is not useful in facilitating the manipulative argumentation. That's my first claim, and not that important one, because I do not think that this is something which with which Mercier and Sperber, this is not the kind of use that Mercier and Sperber would eventually emphasize. But it's one kind of persuasive argumentation. So let's see if something like confirmation bias can be useful here. So recall, confirmation bias is not supposed to be a tendency to support whatever view or idea one thinks about. Only a view or idea that one holds or agrees with. That's how they define the confirmation bias. They say we do not suffer confirmation bias if we consider the ideas of others in the sense that we would try to confirm them. No, we would try rather to reject them in the first instance. What we are supposed to be biased to in producing reason is our belief, our viewpoint, our side, something that we believe and that we want to propagate or to sell to others. After all, the idea was that searching for and producing favorable consideration is supposed to help arguers convince others to adopt the arguer's own ideas or beliefs. That was the idea of transmission of beliefs, including the valuable and true ones. But the problem is here, of course, manipulative, deceiving arguers do not hold, only pretend to hold, views that they want others to adopt. So they are not trying to confirm or support their own views, their own beliefs. They are rather trying to support the views that are different from their own views for some manipulative reasons, obviously. So, if anything, it seems to me that such quite sophisticated reasoners actualize a cognitive ability which is opposite to confirmation bias, because they have to view the issue from a perspective other than, indeed, discrepant with their own and find supporting consideration for it. So this doesn't seem to be the kind of tendency, cognitive tendency that Mercier and Sperber have in mind, which tendency seems to be you have to focus on the consideration on your side, and you ignore or you do not focus, you do not search for, or you do not think about consideration on the other side. But when you try to propagate an idea that is not your own, a kind of belief you do not share, you obviously must consider reasons for the other side of the issue. It's the basic point. So it doesn't seem to me that in this kind of argumentation, manipulative argumentation, confirmation bias, as was defined by Mercier and Sperber, can be a useful feature. Rather, we already have to presuppose some tendency which is contrary to confirmation bias, kind of perspective taking, and so on, although manipulative one. So that was one objection, not that important. But it seems to me also that confirmation bias is not obviously useful in the second case either, which is not manipulative. So strong confirmation bias, according to Mercier and Sperber, should lead us to search for and find consideration supporting our side, but not for consideration supporting the other side of the issue at hand. That's simply the consequence of their definition. What we should overwhelmingly do, focus on reasons for our position or against the opposite positions. So prima facie, however, it is far from obvious that this helps people to persuade other people. Or it's not obvious to me, at least, and to some other authors as well. So for instance, if I can find or anticipate the reasons for your side of the issue at hand that you may voice, I may be better prepared to respond. Sorry, this is the name from the original article. I may be better respond to your objections or request for reasons, thus being in a better position to convince you, not Uk, but you. And there is some evidence for this, empirical evidence from researchers who study empirically argumentation. And there is some evidence that argumentation that considers and rebuts arguments for the other side is regarded more persuasive than argumentation not containing arguments for the other side at all. there are some papers which cite this kind of evidence. So not only you might have suspicion that it would make for a better persuasion if you could anticipate reasons for the other side and be prepared for them so as to efficiently respond to them. But there is also some empirical evidence that people actually tend to regard such argumentation as better and more convincing. So that's one prima facie objection, that even if we consider non-manipulative cases, so if really arguers want to sell their views, their positions, then it's not obvious that confirmation bias as defined by Mercier-Sperber is a useful design feature that promotes that kind of function. So here though is a possible reply on behalf of Mercier-Sperber. I have to say that they are quite clever. They anticipate, they want to preempt a lot of such objections. So that's make for a difficult argumentation, but still I try. So they say, well, of course, but we say that there is this efficient division of labor, which is supposed to be facilitated or triggered by confirmation bias, and is supposed to be cost efficient. In this sense that reasoners should invest efforts in refining their arguments and to consider or rebut counter-arguments only if others push them to do so. So if you want to sell your view, you might produce at first quite cheap or not that refined argument, and you might wait if others would be satisfied with that. If they are satisfied, it's okay, you saved some labor and energy. Only if they are not satisfied and they start to challenge you or object or press you, push you, then you have to start to think about the objection, counter-objection, counter-argument, and so on and so on and so on. Plus, they say it may be difficult to know in advance interlocutors' background beliefs and thus to know what objections or reasons interlocutors would produce themselves or would accept themselves. So if you do not know that, or if it's very difficult to figure out the background beliefs or something like that, so it's again some further work and more speculative and so on, which you would have to invest if you want to anticipate the objections and so on. So they basically say that if we assume this kind of efficient division of labor, then perhaps confirmation bias still makes sense. Okay. But there is a reply to this reply. So first, offloading the production of objections and counters on interlocutors is not obviously a good cost-benefit trade-off. I'm not saying that my suggestions are better, but I'm challenging just the idea that we really have a good idea of what is the good trade-off. And it seems to me that somebody may argue, well, this is not obviously a good trade-off, cost-benefit trade-off, if the goal is to persuade others. So if I want to persuade you, am I really well advised to wait for your objections and counters and be potentially unprepared? As Sterling puts it, forewarned is forearmed. So maybe there is still this enough reason for people to consider, at least to some extent, the reasons for the other side of the issue. And second, it doesn't seem to be, in general, as difficult or costly to anticipate others' objections and counters, assuming some common ground. So a lot of people now today think and say something about common ground. For instance, it's not obvious that if you argue in some communicative, cooperative context, it's so difficult to figure some relevant common ground. So it's not that difficult maybe to figure out some relevant background beliefs, and then it's not that difficult eventually to figure out what others would consider to be relevant objections, reasons, and so on and so on. So, and if this is so, then then the reply of Mercier and Sperber seems less plausible than before. That it's difficult actually to figure out the background beliefs and then to anticipate the objections and reasons of the others. After all, also Mercier and Sperber have to admit that at least up to a point we are able to do that. So after all, I'm supposed to find at least premises consistent with your background beliefs, such that you would find it difficult to reject the conclusions once you accept the premises as plausible. And this already requires some perspective taking or role reversal that is rooted in some kind of common ground, or so one may argue. Of course, the question is how extensive such a common ground may be in what kind of situation, but it's not that obvious that it's always that tricky and difficult to know or to suppose what kind of relevant background beliefs the others might have, and on this basis to figure out what kind of objections or reason they could raise or voice. So that's kind of first reply to the possible reply of Mercier and Sperber. So in this, if you pursue this line of reply, then you can conclude this kind of thing, which is contrary to what Mercier and Sperber conclude. If reasoning really evolved for persuasion, we could expect a better, if not optimal, design. In particular, we should expect that reasoning wouldn't be so lazy and biased, that reasoning wouldn't consider what there is to be said for the other side of the issue at all. Okay, so to repeat, if your goal is to persuade others, maybe the reasoning should be designed by natural selection so as to make reasoners sensitive also to the other side and to the consideration supporting the other side, because that would make eventually for a better persuasion. Perhaps one may speculate by virtue of some kind of selection pressures or arms races that are similar to those that might have shaped mind reading in primates, the so-called Machiavellian intelligence hypothesis or some kind of versions of that. So the idea is how mind reading skills evolved in primates, higher primates, and one idea is in order to anticipate what others might do. So maybe if you want to persuade others, maybe you would be a better persuader if you would be better at anticipating what the others could say, what the others could object. So that's just the suggestion how one might argue that confirmation bias is not obviously a kind of feature that makes it for a better design if the function, the supposed function, is to persuade others. Okay, so that's one kind of objection, and now I have the last objection, which concern the claim, the specific claim of Mercier and Sperber that a strong confirmation bias in producing reasons facilitates an efficient division of labor and so promotes better interactive reasoning. That's something they say, and it seems that, okay, why not? It seems that we really, in arguing for our position, tend to produce consideration in support of our position, so maybe there is some kind of bias of this sort, but I'm still not convinced that what they call strong confirmation bias is still a kind of useful feature here. So I really agree that engaging more minds in a thinking process often, if not always, involves more alternative perspective, so more and better reasons and more and better evaluation of their quality. I do not argue against that. That seems to me kind of plausible. It doesn't seem to me original to Mercier and Sperber, but this idea seems to me a viable one. Also, I do not mean to deny that reasoned exchanges tend to be affected by something like confirmation bias. I'm not sure to what extent. That's a kind of empirical investigation. To what extent we tend to be biased in this way and with respect to what issue. But I admit that we are to some extent. But what I do mean to question is the claim that anything like a strong confirmation bias, even if it is supposed to govern or direct only production of reason, is a useful feature here. So that's my target. Okay, so I do not deny the existence of confirmation bias. I do not deny the fact that interactive reasoning is a kind of efficient reasoning. I do not deny that in interactive reasoning, confirmation bias tends to be less harmful than in individual reasoning, but I still I'm not convinced that confirmation bias is useful in interactive reasoning. And that's my target here. So, as I intimated at the beginning, Mercier and Sperber do recognize this important thing, that a strong confirmation bias, a tendency to confirm your view or to support your view and to disconfirm the opposed view. So a strong confirmation bias in this sense, in evaluation of arguments, would make argumentation pointless. So it just can't be that we are strongly biased across the board. Because, as they say, when we evaluate others' arguments, the main task of reasoning is to recognize good arguments and to make us change our mind accordingly so that we end up with better beliefs on average. A strong mindset bias in an evaluation would make argumentation pointless. So obviously the idea is that, what I said before, if by default I somehow assume that my position is the right one, then why should I engage in argumentation? Or I might engage in argumentation, but definitely not for the sake of changing my views or something like that. So it would be kind of dogmatist position. And dogmatists are particularly unlikely to be convinced by arguments of others. So they say, their solution is to say, well, so there is a confirmation, strong confirmation governing production of reason, but there is no confirmation bias or no strong confirmation bias governing evaluation of reason. It already seems to me to be kind of schizophrenic solution because usually we are both producers and evaluators, and somehow this picture supposes that we switch between two frames of minds as we produce arguments and as we assess arguments, but that's the idea. So, and this supposition saves the situation, because if we admit that confirmation somehow contaminates also evaluation of reason, so we have obviously a problem. We can't claim that confirmation bias is a useful feature, because it would prevent argumentation from establishing its point. But I am not convinced of this, and I realize that many people are not convinced of my reasons for this, but still I elaborated this at length in the paper, so just briefly here, and we can return to that in the discussion. So my problem is this, I wonder, how can I be, or you can be, almost unbiased in my evaluation of your arguments when I am also supposed to be a strongly biased advocate of my own view, which is typically inconsistent with your view, because typically Mercier and Sperber say that the occasion for argumentation is disagreement. That's their claim. Disagreement in ideas triggers argumentation, supposed to perform this persuasive function. So my wonder concerns how I can be unbiased evaluator if I'm biased, strongly biased, advocate of my own views when I am trying to make up a favorable case supporting them. So it seems to me at least that evaluation, and that's a kind of controversial point, that evaluation in part, and maybe often in large part, consist in testing, in something like testing arguments of others, including by searching for and finding various objections, counters, rebuttals, underminers, defeaters, or other consideration of this sort. And if we don't find them, then maybe we may be eventually convinced. And this is not something that Mercier and Sperber deny, but they have their own model that we first somehow evaluate others' arguments intuitively and impartially or objectively. And we intuitively can be swayed by good arguments if they are good. And it seems to me that this is a problematic idea because that works at best with some kind of very simple arguments and maybe uncontroversial topics or issues, but it obviously won't work with topics which are considered to be controversial and topics with respect to which we take sides and have a disagreement. So if I disagree with you and you say something with which I disagree and you provide some consideration, then usually and more often than not I would test your ideas because they go contrary to my ideas. But now there is a problem in my view, because if testing of your ideas and arguments consist in large part in producing objections, counters, and other consideration of this sort, so this is also supposed to be governed by a strong my-side bias, according to the definition of Sperber and Mercier, because they say confirmation bias strongly governs productions of reasons for our ideas or against the ideas that we disagree with. So I obviously disagree with your ideas, and if I'm not convinced immediately and intuitively by your simply compelling arguments, then I start to test them. I start to test them by producing reasons of sorts, arguments of sorts. And if this is also supposed to be governed by strong my-side bias, then I suspect then the chances are that I will not be eventually convinced by your ideas, because I would proceed as the profile of confirmation bias suggests. I would just pile up argumentations and objections against your view and your arguments, and Mercier and Sperber say that I should be good at it, actually. So they say explicitly that we are quite good at finding reasons against the views with which we disagree. So it seems to me that it's better that we shouldn't be too good at that. But my worry is that if we are supposed to be strongly governed by confirmation bias in production of reasons, and if production of reasons likely contaminates also evaluations of reasons, then it seems to me that the chances are that also the evaluation of reasons would be distorted by this strong confirmation bias, and that would be counterproductive. So such a feature, in short, according to me, can hardly be regarded as a design feature of interactive reasoning. So basically the argument is that even if we suppose that the kind of strong confirmation bias governs only production of reasons, then if production of reasons is closely interrelated with evaluation of reason, it still tends to be a troublemaker in argumentation. It still tends to impede the function of convincing others. So that's basically the argument. It's better developed in my paper, I hope so, but that's for it. And I also offer some diagnosis in the paper at the end of the paper why people are attracted to say that something like strong confirmation bias might be useful. It seems to me that the problem is that the problem with this idea is that there is a tendency to note some kind of vital and functional feature of reason giving, of reason exchange, which is basically that if we have a disagreement, we naturally tend to defend our position primarily with supporting reasons, for instance, if we are challenged and so on. But this doesn't seem to me to be anything worth calling confirmation bias. So every theoretician of argumentation presumably agrees that in the situation of disagreement, we naturally tend to give reasons for our views. So, but my suspicion is that this simply can't be what is meant by confirmation bias, because it's kind of normal feature of division of argumentative labor, which nobody before called confirmation bias. Confirmation bias arises only if, at least in my view, if I tend to produce confirming reasons in support of my side disproportionately to the evidence or reasons that you provide for your side. So to the extent that I favorize the reasons for my side and tend to be blind or tend to not to count in the consideration which you produce, that I may suffer for something worth calling confirmation bias. But simply to produce consideration favoring my claim in the exchange of position doesn't seem to me worth calling confirmation bias. So if somebody says that something like weak confirmation bias can be a useful feature, I would say, well, I don't know what weak confirmation bias is supposed to be other than this functional and obviously useful feature of argumentative division of labor. What I recognize as something worth calling confirmation bias is this kind of strong confirmation bias, but then I claim that this kind of strong confirmation bias is unlikely to be a design useful feature of interactive reasoning, just as it is not a useful feature of individual reasoning. So that's basically for my arguments. Thanks for your attention, and that's the end of the presentation.
Thank you for the talk. We have half an hour for the discussion. And there is one, if you have a question, then just use the raise your hand button. And there is one hand raised already, someone called ZM. Do you have a question? Hi, Jim. Are you here? Do you have a question? Okay, so we can wait a second and we'll see whether we'll have some response. But if there are any other questions, just use the raise your hand button. Preston?
Yeah, so Lazo, what do you say to a person who thinks that the strong confirmation bias is something that's going to require weighing evaluations, weighing assessments from other people, but not in a way that requires that you completely discount the reasons that the other propositions offer, regardless of who says them? So it seems like your account requires that we think that confirmation bias is so strong that it prevents us from considering good reasons, even if they're presented from someone else. Whereas it seems like all that somebody like Mercier and Sperber need to do, all that they need to have is that confirmation bias plays whatever role it plays in terms of tending us to discount views that go against our own. But so long as there's a strong enough recognition of reasons independent of perspective in play, then that strength can be counterbalanced by our ability to recognize the strength of reasons.
Sorry, but you suggest that confirmation bias might be useful because it allows us to discount wrong views?
No, I'm bracketing questions of usefulness here. This is just on the last slide at the end on this question, this worry that
Well, so in part, my strategy is that I just follow what they say because they themselves says that there is some kind of strong bias governing the production of reason. So that's not my term. My worry is that you have to somehow define this tendency. This is already a tricky thing because I have right now maybe 50 different articles about the topic, and everybody defines confirmation bias differently. So in this paper, I just defined it, or I just took the definition of Mercier and Sperber, which is also mimicked by Smith and Wald and in part by Norman. And they say that we have a strong tendency to give and produce reasons for our ideas and against the ideas of others. And so my last argument hinges on the idea that if this is a strong tendency, and if I am right that producing reasons can be separated from evaluating of reasons, so my worry is that the strong tendency would tend to be counterproductive also in evaluating reasons. And I can imagine something like weak tendency, just to produce reasons for my claim, and eventually also the reasons, prima facie reasons for the other claims. But I don't know why I should call this a confirmation bias.
No, that's fair. I agree that characterizing it in that weak way would it runs the risk of just sort of having no content to the claim. My issue was really with this third bullet point here. If a strong confirmation bias drives the process, chances are that we will pile up objections and counter arguments and counters to others' arguments, in which case we could hardly be swayed by them. My thought was just, well, whatever strong confirmation bias is going to be, and granted, no clear notion of what it is, and also that we don't want it to be this weak thing, which makes it look like there's no confirmation bias at all. Somebody like Mercier and Sperber might say, all we need is that whatever we mean by confirmation bias, there is nevertheless this countervailing tendency to be able to recognize the force of the reason, so that it's not the case that we pile up objections and counters and could hardly be swayed by them. There's a tendency to do that, and the tendency is such that in some cases we discount the reasons that others give us when we shouldn't, but it's not such a strong characterization that prevents us from seeing.
Okay, that's fair enough. My argument here would be, well, okay, but then you can have the same combination, virtuous combination, if you just suppose natural division of cognitive labor. And kind of, I take side, you take side, I give reasons for my side, you give reasons for your side. We are all interested eventually to end up with better view. And we are supposed to be objective enough evaluators, and we end up with the same result. I don't see that we need, and maybe something like confirmation bias is consistent with that, but I do not see that we have provided the best explanation of the profile. So
if I understand you, then you're sort of forcing a dilemma on Mercier and Sperber. Either strong confirmation bias is such that we get this problem that your third bullet point points out, or we avoid that problem, but then it just ends up being what you're calling weak confirmation bias, which is really no.
Yeah, what I'm suggesting that I say that, well, in a way, I might agree with many things that they say, but in a way, it seems to me that the kind of phenomenon which is usually called, although, as I said in the discussions, that the phenomenon is a little bit tricky, shifting target, at the end of the day, it seems to me that they explain away, rather they explain the phenomenon which usually psychologists have in mind. So if they define the tendency which is supposed to be healthy, just as the kind of tendency to produce reasons for my position, if I made a position, then I'm fine, but I wouldn't call that confirmation bias.
Yeah. Okay, fair enough.
Other questions? I might ask a question by myself. I would like to ask what kind of scenarios they consider when they talk about confirmation bias. It looks like they consider scenarios in which you can evaluate, retrospectively whether an argument or reason was good or bad. And second, it seems like the scenarios are such that the advantage of reasoning should be on a group level. Is that correct? Do I understand it correctly?
What was the first one?
That you can assess retrospectively whether a reason was good or bad. Is this correct?
And this is supposed to be connected to confirmation bias, this scenario?
Yes. So my idea is that there might be other advantage of confirmation bias than just something like a better reasoning skill of a group or some advantage for a group. So the advantage might be personal. For example, I might gain some social status and the scenario might be such that I suggest that the food is on a place A and someone else will suggest that the food is on a place B. And as a matter of fact, the food can be on both locations. But if I persuade others that they should go on a place A and they will find food there, then I will gain some social status, personally. And if the situation is such that people cannot go to the place B, then they cannot evaluate whether the reason of someone else, or my opposer was good or bad. So I will gain social status that is some kind of individual advantage for me, and I will use confirmation bias for that.
No, I do not see. I don't quite see the role of confirmation bias specifically here, though they have another part of the theory which I do not discuss in the paper because it's in my view a more promising strategy. They have the view that we also use reasoning to justify ourselves and our actions, and here also they claim makes sense to display something like confirmation bias. So usually we have done something and somebody doesn't like that and people start to challenge us and then we start to explain ourselves and we want to defend also ourselves and so on. So that's here the status is obviously in play. Indirectly also the status in play in argumentative practices because, I don't know, we want to look right and so on. But I'm not sure about the first context, how exactly to connect that to the value of confirmation bias. So there are theories of confirmation bias that say exactly that the confirmation bias is somehow connected to self-esteem, self-enhancement in the social arena and so on, but that's not necessarily connected to argumentation. You can have different theories of confirmation bias which say that, we like the idea of being right, we don't like the idea of being wrong, and that's why we insist on our views or on our beliefs. But it's not obvious that this is a kind of explanation. It's not obvious that this is not an alternative explanation to the explanation which provide Mercier and Sperber. They specifically want to say that confirmation bias evolved or stabilized, but basically they stay evolved in the context of evolution of argumentative practices for the purpose of persuasion. So I'm not sure, maybe you will explain it to me today in the evening what you mean, but I'm not right now sure where this leads. Sorry.
Okay. Athanasios?
So first, thank you very much for the talk. It's been very enlightening. My question is this. You pointed out already that according to Mercier and Sperber, the purpose of argumentation or persuasion is to help us arrive at better belief, or like a better reason. In fact, better than the ones we began the process of argumentation with. And I've also pointed out also that in the event where we have this argumentative process influenced by a strong confirmatory bias, we might end up just piling up objections and counters because each one is trying to defend their position. And for that reason, it can't be useful in the interactive sense. But on that foundation, what answer would you give to somebody who would suggest the opposite, that it is actually useful in the interactive process, in the sense that it is cognitively useful? Because for as long as we continue to interact and pile objections, in the end, everything I say after every other point I make, I try to make sure that it is stronger than the first point I made. So if in objecting to your reasons, I make point A, you make a response, I would make sure that the next objection I raise to your reply is more like a reply to a reply. I would have to make sure that every reply I make to any other reply is actually stronger than your reply and the first reply I made. So in that interactive sense, couldn't it be cognitively useful? Because it helps us actually to hone into or hone better our argumentative skills and assigning reasons.
Well, that part of probably what they mean, Mercedes probably mean that it makes for a stronger process. But it seems to me that what makes for a stronger process is the cognitive division of labor. Not necessarily something like strong my-side bias. It seems to me that strong my-side bias, as defined by them, forces you to find objections to the other views and arguments. And if it contaminates evaluation, so there is no assurance that the process will go like you suggest, that we will give better and better and stronger arguments. By just if I am biased to confirm my side, and I think that I am right, and this infects also my reception of your arguments, that I'm not sure that the process will continue in the way you suggest, that I would try to give better arguments. Maybe I would try to give good arguments to rebut you and not to be concerned at all then with what you will say later. So it seems to me that obviously everybody understands that insofar as we argue with each other and insofar as argumentation is successful, as sometimes it's not, but often it is, so we can't be biased through and through. My concern is that is there really a good case made for the claim that bias is still strong bias is kind of useful, even though only up to a point, because then we suppose that there is also this evaluation which compensates for the bias. So this dialectics of biased reasoning and unbiased evaluation, to me it still sounds easier to say, well, we might be biased for different reasons. Maybe we can even explain bias. We can even have a theory that, I don't know, evolution of argumentative reasoning makes room for the evolution of bias. In combination with some social factors. Maybe there was already something like confirmation bias before, and it didn't make so much harm in the context of interactive reasoning. But it doesn't seem to me plausible to claim that something like a strong tendency to produce ideas in form of our views, which we suppose to be the right ones, and against the views which are opposed, would be useful for the postulated function. So but my answer is that I do not see that this kind of logic in dialectics, which you suggest that would result from kind of biased reasoning on all sides, would indeed result from the biased reasoning. It seems to me that if such a reasoning would result, so it would result from other factors and other causes than biases. And if the reasoning is supposed to yield good performance, it seems to me that it has to overcome and mitigate or hold in check the biases or whatever. And once you start to use those metaphors of holding in check, mitigating, or sometimes taming the biases, to me it sounds like, well, why should we tame or mitigate or hold in check something which is obviously useful or facilitates some kind of beneficial function? And Mercier and Sperber oscillate between these two metaphors themselves. Sometimes they say my-side bias, confirmation bias is held in check in interactive reasoning or is mitigated, which means so interactive reasoning and the logic of mutual checks and intersubjectivity and I don't know what, division of labor, holds in check this kind of tendencies, because if they are not held in check, they tend to be counterproductive. It seems to me that that's the idea. Sometimes when they are bolder in their later writings, they change the rhetorics and they said, well, let's make the best of the my-side bias. And so I'm not quite sure what this means to make the best of the my-side bias. I know what it means to make the best of the division of labor within argumentative context, but I don't see what it makes if it makes sense to make the best of something like strong confirmation bias as they define it. That's my position.
Could I quickly follow up?
We have one more question, but I think we have time for if it's a quick follow-up, then go ahead.
Oh, okay. Because the scenario is this. You are defending your position A. You are biased towards your position A, and then you are advancing arguments to support your position A. I am against your position A, and I'm also advancing the arguments to trivialize your position A. So it will be counterproductive in the sense that at the end of the argumentation process, we do not arrive at a common ground. But for as long as it is interactive, it means that I am compelled at every stage in the argument, and you are also compelled at every stage in the argument to advance better arguments at every stage than the argument you advanced earlier on. So that it is I admit that it is counterproductive in helping us finding common ground, but as an intellectual exercise, as a cognitive process, shouldn't it make us think better? That is the question I raised.
That's okay. Now I'm sorry, I misunderstood you. It's an interesting idea that confirmation bias actually makes us cognitively more agile, whereas my reading of the literature suggests that confirmation bias rather, that's the fear, that's the worry, that it rather makes us not that intellectually agile as we should be. So my response to this is that it still seems to me that there is a kind of conflation between kind of natural division of argumentative labor, which can have also this kind of dynamics. It can have also a different kind of dynamics and something like confirmation bias. To the extent that I'm really biased, strongly biased, just to pile up arguments for my position, I'm not sure that this kind of exercise likely follows from so biased minds. So it might follow, it might not, but definitely it doesn't make, definitely even if it follows, you agree that it doesn't ensure that we converge at the common ground, or even that it interferes with that. So still my point, if it's valid, would remain that insofar as the function of reasoning is to converge on some kind of common ground, or insofar as the point of reasoning is to converge to some kind of better answer, better idea, then I still am not convinced that this kind of bias is helpful in this respect. Maybe you find a situation in which super biased minds, dogmatist minds can exchange this kind of arguments and better arguments, better arguments, better arguments. I'm not sure that this would transpire, but it still is not against my view that, or it's not against my argument that confirmation bias is not helpful with respect to the kind of function which Mercier and Sperber postulate. What do you postulate is kind of different function, maybe some kind of, I don't know, more interesting intellectual performance, or I don't know what, but it's not the kind of function with Mercier and Sperber postulate. Sorry, I have no better answer to that. So,
fair enough. Thank you.
Okay, I suggest moving forward. Anke, can I ask you a question?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, thanks a lot for this very interesting talk. I think I agree with many things that you said, and I have kind of a naive question. So my question is, wouldn't it help to distinguish between stating a reason and just considering a reason for oneself? Like, it seems much more plausible to me to say there's confirmation bias concerning which reasons I actually state in a communicative exchange, but still I might consider a bunch of reasons against the view I'm trying to push in that exchange. So what would you say to this? Would this be confirmation bias at all? Or, yeah.
No, my position tends to be that I don't see the motive for calling this confirmation bias. It still seems to me that it just can't be that easy to say that whenever I'm stating a position and I'm expected by others, giving and asking for reasons to defend it, that I am prone, I might be liable, but I wouldn't say that I am, by the same fact, ipso facto, that I am exhibiting some kind of confirmation bias. My position is that I'm exhibiting something worth calling confirmation bias only if I display this kind of tendency and persist in displaying this kind of tendency despite the kind of arguments and evidence that the other side, produces. I tend to discount them, ignore them, or somehow dismiss them. That's the extreme, that I might somehow discount them and not weigh them really as they should be. And that seems to me, that's kind of tendency which we exhibit in some areas is a kind of dangerous tendency, and seems to me that is kind of tendency that is worth calling confirmation bias, because that very same kind of tendency is also called confirmation bias in the context of individual thinking. But I just don't see any reason to call anything like tendency to support my views in the case of disagreement, and where others challenge me by supporting reasons, or eventually if others give their views and reasons to consider challenges or objection to their reasons, that alone doesn't seem to me worth calling confirmation bias. I can agree that once this tendency is in place, there is some room for developing also this more harmful tendency, but I do not see that this more harmful tendency has been explained. I do not doubt that it can be explained, maybe by some additions to the theory, but the claim was that just because we have on the table this kind of hypothesis, it directly follows from it that we should naturally display this kind of tendency worth calling confirmation bias. And that doesn't seem to follow, according to me. What I see is that obviously if that hypothesis is on the table, it follows that there should be something which is adaptive, like the division of cognitive argumentative labor. So You can imagine Brandonian model, you can imagine Hugh Price's model, whatever. All these models are consistent with some kind of division of cognitive labor, which is supposed to be kind of efficient, helpful, and so on. But I don't see how you can move simply, in a simple step, from this tendency, which is okay, to be expected, I agree, to this more problematic tendency. And it seems to me that Mercier and Sperber sometimes just say, well, it's basically the same kind of tendency, and I'm not really sure why I should consider them to be the same tendency. So that's my position. Maybe I'm wrong, but I tend to call confirmation bias something which causes problems, and in the particular way because you are somehow partial to your own position and to your reasons and consideration in favor or positions, disproportionately to what evidence there is or consideration that there is for the other position. So if Mercier and Sperber argue that, but we obviously can successfully argue and can change our minds, then I say, okay, that's obviously the case, but then I would say that we are not so prone, or we are not prone, or that's despite of our suffering or being liable to this kind of harmful tendency. So I would prefer the metaphor of that being despite, not due to something like confirmation bias. So I'm turning about around the same point with respect to all the questions. I have to be convinced that there is some added value of assuming some positive adaptive role for something like confirmation bias in a strong sense. I'm not denying that there is some kind of natural division of labor which seems to have kind of very similar profile. But to have a very, if I can, also Mercier acknowledges that somebody can argue in this way, because he said, well, somebody can argue that, so how can you distinguish confirmation bias from the situation in which you arrived at your belief via good evidence or reasons? Somebody has a view which disagrees with your own, that challenges you to provide some reasons. And you, of course, obviously would provide the reasons which you gathered, which you think are good, but is that supposed to be a confirmation bias? But you still proceed as if you satisfy this definition of the confirmation bias. You still piles up the consideration in favor of your side, but there is nothing like confirmation bias, even according to Mercier, because your position was arrived at via good evidence and reasons, so you just give them to others. So you have the same tendency to give support. You have maybe the division of cognitive labor, also the other might be in the same position, but is that confirmation bias? That alone is not confirmation bias, it seems to me. Sorry, that's the response.
We have basically run out of time. Wally, do you have a short question? James, Wally, do you have a short question? If you have a short question, then go ahead and ask.
Okay, my question is, so I want to understand, are you trying to say that confirmation bias is not natural to all people? I want to know whether it's a natural tendency or it is not natural.
I'm not claiming that. I'm myself puzzled by the phenomenon. So maybe it is natural. It does seem like kind of natural. Also, the question is, what do you mean by natural? It certainly seems to be kind of tendency which we seem to exhibit to some extent in some situation. I would say more in some situation than in others, more with respect to some issues than with others. So in this sense, it might be natural. I'm just not claiming that I have explanation of confirmation bias. I'm interested that other people, or intrigued by other people claiming that they have. This particular explanation is intriguing one, but I am not convinced that it works. I do not claim anything about naturalness or otherwise. Probably it is a kind of natural, maybe quite robust feature which tends to affect our thinking. I'm not against this suggestion.
Okay, I'm really sorry, but I have to stop the discussion right now because we have run out of time. I would like to thank Ladislav for the talk, and we'll see each other in 2 weeks, and Anke Breuning will give a lecture on cellars and science and the mind. Anke, we are looking forward
Thank you.
for the lecture, and thanks for the lecture, Ladislav, once again.